This is episode 121 of the Trauma Coaching for Latter-day Saints podcast. What do the core needs have to do with trauma? I'm your host, Anita Bremer. I'm a Latter-day Saint mom with a history of trauma. I've figured out how to heal my trauma, and I can help you do the same. Why? Because trauma is one obstacle to gathering Zion. Let's talk about what it takes to truly heal and find lasting joy. I just recognized how many times I say trauma in that intro, so you're welcome. All right. I think today is going to be a short and sweet episode, but also really necessary. So, after publishing the last 5 episodes where I went through the core needs one at a time, I had a coach friend reach out to me, and she had listened to at least the episode on attunement. And she was asking me some questions. And I thought, wow, these are some really good questions. I think I'm going to do another kind of follow-up episode about these questions. So the first thing I want to say that I don't think I explicitly said in these episodes about the 5 core needs are that these core needs are kind of the bedrock, the foundation to attachment theory. So if you've heard of attachment theory, oftentimes we think of it in terms of like, do you have an anxious attachment? Do you have a disorganized attachment? Do you have a secure attachment? Do you have an avoidant attachment, right? You might have heard of those terms. And those attachment styles come from how our caregivers met us with these 5 core needs, right? And probably more than just the 5 core needs, but essentially like how our original caregivers were in relationship with us, taught us how to be in relationship with other people. And, so therefore that's like the basis of attachment theory, right? I kind of think of attachment theory of how we learn to be in relationship with each other based on how our original caregivers met or didn't meet our needs. So one of the questions that my friend asked me was, how does this relate to trauma? Which I just thought was such a brilliant question. Very simple question. Some of the most brilliant questions are very simple. And what I want to make very clear in this episode is that trauma is anything internally that feels overwhelming, right? Anything that we don't have enough support or resources to handle on our own. And so we get overwhelmed and we shut down, right? And developmental trauma, a particular flavor of trauma, is when we get overwhelmed by kind of, life or relationships because of these patterns we've learned to create within ourselves and in our relationships based off of how our original caregivers met or didn't meet our needs, right? So these core needs, whether we were attuned to or we weren't, or it was inconsistent, how do I say this? If our core needs were not met, then our nervous system will develop in a way, because remember, these core needs are from like in utero or at least from birth. And so if we didn't have our needs met, then our nervous system will literally be primed and groomed toward either thinking that the world is in general a safe place or that the world is in general not a safe place, right? And I would say, very broadly speaking, that if your original caregivers couldn't meet your needs in a way that your body and mind wanted them to be met, then you will develop your nervous system in a way that you view the world in general as a not safe place, as a place where we have to be on guard and we have to watch out and that kind of thing, right? Now, there are so many factors to this. It's not just our original caregivers. But in general, our attachment style determines a lot of how our nervous system develops. And our nervous system and how it develops determines how likely we are to endure trauma. Like I think of it like how sensitive we are to the world and whether or not things will be perceived as threats, right? So if you go back to episode 108, where I discussed the phases of trauma response, the very first phase is the startle response. Now, we all need to be startled at times. And if we aren't startled when we should be startled, that's a problem just as much as if when we are startled when we shouldn't be startled, right? So in that episode 108, where I talk about phases of trauma response, you can draw conclusions from how our nervous system is developing, how our attachment is developing, and how likely we are to get overwhelmed, right? And if trauma is anything that overwhelms your system, then you can see how these core needs being met or not met, our attachment styles, essentially our development, really informs how we relate to the world and whether or not we are going to go into those trauma response phases, whether or not we're going to be startled, whether or not we're going to want to run away or fight, or whether or not we'll be overwhelmed and then shut down and go into the freeze response, right? So they're all related and they all kind of grow on each other. And also just remember that trauma, the word trauma, the original Greek for this word is wound. So anytime we have any kind of wound, an attachment wound, an emotional wound, a psychological wound, a mental wound, that could be considered a trauma. Now, sometimes we have wounds and then we have resources or people there to help us kind of process through those wounds, right? So then it doesn't become a trauma, because a trauma is something, it's too little for too long, or it's too much too fast. And it's when we don't have the resources or support to get through a, scary or overwhelming situation. So you might think, like my friend did, that she didn't really have trauma and that trauma is a buzzword, which I totally agree that it's a buzzword. And I also think that there's a reason why it's a buzzword. But you might not think that you really have trauma. And I would just say that probably everyone has some amount of trauma. My friend actually, we were talking back and forth, and she said, well, I was a really anxious kid. So when I talked about this part about how our nervous system develops toward believing that the world is generally a safe place or generally not a safe place, she was like, well, I was a really anxious kid and I was pretty much scared of everything. I was that way too, myself. And so if you're like that, if as a kid you're like kind of viewing the world as a not safe place, then chances are you probably have endured some developmental trauma. Was it intentional? Probably not. Can you get over it? Absolutely. Right? That's why I do this podcast, because I believe that there is hope for all of us and that the wounds that we carry with us can be healed if we know how to meet them. Right? I also just wanted to mention in this episode that I feel like the world is becoming a place where pretty much everyone has some kind of trauma, even pretty intense stuff, right? And it makes sense when we think about it in terms of anything that overwhelms our system. And if it comes from these, partially at least, from these 5 core needs not being met, which can, go into developmental trauma, then we basically have a world of people who weren't met in their needs, trying to raise people and not being able to meet our little people's needs, right? So it makes sense that the world would be becoming more and more traumatized, so to speak, right? If you've ever had that question, like, it seems like everyone has trauma. Now, the other thing I want to say is, if you quote unquote have trauma, that's sort of how I talk about it. It might not be actually useful to talk about it that way, to say like my trauma or I have trauma. It might be more useful to say like the things I endured that wounded me in this way, right? So a little clunkier, a little longer, but we don't want to identify with our traumas. It's not necessarily the fault of our caregivers, right? I have mentioned this before on the podcast. The fact that we needed something and our caregivers couldn't meet us in those needs fully, doesn't mean that it's our caregiver's fault. So I really like to be careful with that because it's so easy to slip into like, oh, well, I was an anxious kid, so my parents did something wrong. No, maybe not. Maybe you just born into this world with a little bit more sensitivity, a little more needs, and your parents didn't know how or couldn't meet you in those needs. It doesn't mean that it's fault, right? I tend to like to think about nature. If a tree has a branch that comes off in a snowstorm, it's not like the snowstorm's fault. It's just nature. It's just how things are. So I feel like that's a really useful and compassionate view, a way to view all of this. So I hope that answers some questions about how attachment and the nervous system and trauma are all related. And I will just say that when I was renaming this podcast and going in the direction of trauma, I thought, gosh, do I want to use the word trauma? Because it is a buzzword. And like I said, I do think it's a buzzword for a reason, that we need to be more educated about trauma. But really, oftentimes when we say trauma, what we mean is nervous system regulation or nervous system awareness, right? Just like how our nervous systems function optimally and not optimally, right? And when we're not functioning optimally in our nervous system, that could be thought of as trauma. It's not like it's necessarily a huge deal, but sometimes, over and over again, if our nervous systems are functioning suboptimally, that can cause some problems, right? And so you might want to be like, you know what? I want to learn how to regulate my nervous system. I want to learn how to be more aware. I want to learn how to connect with myself so that I can connect with others, right? So we can kind of overcome some of these attachment wounds. That is exactly what I do in my group coaching program, Presence. We learn how to be more present with our internal and external environments so that we can become more regulated and stay more in this window of our nervous system, this window of tolerance where we're not extremely agitated or anxious and we're not extremely shut down. We are creative and connected and calm and, able to withstand the stressors of life, right? That's where we want to live most of our lives. So I hope this episode helps you understand some of that context that's not like shock trauma. It's not like, oh, I was in a car accident and now I just can't drive a car anymore, right? Some of these developmental trauma pieces that many, many, many of us did not understand or recognize as traumas. Again, doesn't mean there's anything majorly wrong or there's anybody to blame, but it is something to think about, right? Okay, so come and join Presence right now through the end of March. If you pay in full for 1 year, it's a 1 year membership and you can pay monthly or you can pay in full for the year and get a little bit of a discount. If you pay in full right now, you become a lifetime member, which means you pay for 1 year and you get to stay as long as you want. And I'm hoping to keep this group intact really for the rest of my career. And there's a part of me that doesn't ever want to retire. So maybe for the rest of my life, right? Now it might morph and change, but you'll always have access to it. So I think it's a fantastic opportunity and deal. And here's the thing, if you don't join, then that's a win for me because then the group stays a little bit more small and intimate and I get to feel more free to test things out. And then I'm not giving away lifetime memberships for the one price. And if you do join, then that's a win for me too. I get to help another person in the world become more regulated and be able to rest, truly rest, and to be able to have more creativity and more connection in their relationships. So that's amazing too. Either way, I don't care. I'm on a mission to educate people about trauma and to help us become more regulated and to feel the way we want to feel, to have an experience of life that we want to have. But if it's not right for you right now or ever, that's okay too. right? So I just really want you to know that there's no pressure here, but I do think that presence is a beautiful place to be. It's a beautiful community. It's very healing. It's very accepting and open. And I'm just loving it every single time that I show up to presence. I am absolutely loving it. I have another little offer. And I think today is the last day. I have become an affiliate for the Creation Coach School, and certification, the Creation Coach certification is open through today. So if you're listening the day this podcast comes out, you can go to the link in the description or the link in the show notes and get more information. But basically, I went through the Creation Coach School certification last year. I really enjoyed it. It changed my life fundamentally in a couple ways. And I actually just did a bonus episode about this as well. So go back and listen to the bonus episode. And if you have ever thought about getting certified as a coach, or if you're just interested in hearing Brooke Snow's way of thinking about the gospel meets self-help, she's brilliant at it. It's an amazing program. And if you use my link to sign up, then I will offer an accountability Voxer group. So we'll have whoever uses my link will be in this group, and you can ask me anything or get coaching. You can ask about business, you can ask about coaching, you can ask about any of the concepts that are in the Creation Coach course, which is part of the certification. And I'll be doing it again this year with you. So fun. Let me know if you have any questions about that, but today is the last day for that. I believe they are going to be opening this certification twice a year. So maybe right now is not the right time. And so just kind of put it in your back pocket and revisit it in a few months. Okay, that's enough for now. And so are you. Thank you for listening, sharing, and leaving ratings and reviews. If you're ready to address your own trauma with my support, go to danitabremmer.com to schedule a free trauma assessment call. Until next time, go be yourself and follow the spirit.